Zaccharie Risacher, born April 8, 2005. As the 2026 NBA draft approaches and teams start aligning themselves with prospects, you can feel the excitement build around the league again. Fresh blood is entering the NBA, fan bases are getting hope back, and franchises are convincing themselves that the next superstar may finally be on the way. But every draft also reminds us of the other side of excitement. What happens when a highly drafted player never becomes what he was supposed to be? And not just any lottery pick, what about the number one picks of the last decade? Which ones actually lived up to the hype, and which ones left fans wondering what teams really saw in them to begin with? For me, one name stands out already, Zaccharie Risacher. And honestly, I'm not even surprised. Even in what many considered a weak 2024 draft class, I never got the feeling he was truly a number one overall type prospect. He never had that alpha presence, takeover energy, or sense that he would eventually become the face of a franchise. That doesn't mean he's a bad player or that he doesn't belong in the NBA, but becoming a solid NBA player and living up to the expectations of a number one pick are two completely different things. And heading into year 3, Risacher is starting to look more like a role player than a future star for these reasons. What happened? Let's talk about it. It's your boy JC Stunted Growth. Let's get him. Like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know who I should do next. Zaccharie Risacher is a 6'9" French small forward who was born in Malaga, Spain, while his father, Stéphane Risacher, was playing professional basketball overseas. Basketball was already in his blood from the beginning. After growing up mainly in Lyon, France, Risacher developed through the ASVEL youth system, the same organization once connected to Tony Parker. But unlike Victor Wembanyama, Risacher was never viewed as some generational prospect or future face of basketball early on. His rise came more from projection than domination. Scouts loved his size, defensive potential, fluid movement, and the idea that his shooting ability could eventually turn him into a perfect modern NBA wing. During the 23-24 season on loan with J.L. Borg, Risacher showed enough flashes to rise into serious number one pick conversations. He displayed promising off-ball movement, solid defensive instincts, and stretches where his jump shot looked polished. But even with the upside, questions still followed him entering the draft, although throughout the process he was considered the clear consensus top pick with Alex Sarr. He wasn't known as an elite shot creator, didn't consistently dominate offensively, and often looked more like a complementary piece than a future superstar. Still, because the 2024 NBA draft lacked a clear-cut franchise-changing prospect, Risacher's stock continued to climb throughout the year. By draft night, the Atlanta Hawks selected him with the number one overall pick, hoping his upside and fit alongside Trae Young could eventually help reshape the future of the franchise. Stunt number 1, the weakest number one pick race in years. Part of what makes Zaccharie Risacher's situation so unique is that his story really started before he even stepped foot on an NBA court. Because truthfully, a lot of people never fully bought into him being the best player in the draft to begin with. The 2004 NBA draft was viewed by scouts and analysts as one of the weakest draft classes in recent memory. There was no Victor Wembanyama level prospect, no Anthony Edwards type athlete, and no obvious franchise-changing superstar sitting at the top waiting to hear his name called. Instead, the entire draft process felt uncertain from the beginning. Teams weren't necessarily looking at future superstars as much as they were trying to convince themselves which prospect had the safest pathway toward becoming one. That environment ended up helping Risacher more than anybody. The closer the draft got, the more teams started falling in love with the idea of what he could become rather than what he already was. His size, shooting flashes, defensive upside, and smooth movement checked a lot of modern NBA boxes. At 6'9", he looked like the type of wing every organization dreams about plugging into today's game. Long, switchable defenders who can also space the floor are valuable, and Atlanta talked themselves into believing they were selecting the safest future star available. The problem though is that safe and superstar are not the same thing. Usually when a player goes number one overall, there's a certain energy surrounding them that feels undeniable. With Risacher, that feeling never really existed. He wasn't dominating overseas competition, wasn't viewed as some elite scorer, and didn't have the type of individual skill set that instantly jumps off the screen. Most of the conversation around him relied heavily on projection and imagination. People kept discussing what he might eventually become years down the line instead of what he already consistently showed on the floor. That's why so many fans questioned the pick immediately after it happened. It wasn't necessarily that Risacher looked bad, it was that he never looked like a player worthy of carrying the expectations attached to being the number 1 overall pick. There's a major difference between selecting a promising young wing and selecting the player you believe can eventually change your franchise. Atlanta drafted Risacher hoping he would grow into something bigger over time. But when you're picked first overall, fans expect signs of greatness much sooner than later, and heading into his 3rd season, those signs still feel difficult to find. Stunt number 2, he never had a superstar skill. One of the biggest reasons people continue questioning Zaccharie Risacher as a number 1 overall pick is because even now it's still difficult to point to one truly elite skill that separates him from other young wings around the league. Usually when a player is drafted first overall, there's something undeniable about their game. Maybe it's elite athleticism, dominant scoring ability, high-level playmaking, or a skill so advanced that teams feel comfortable building an entire franchise around it. With Risacher, most of his strengths are more complementary than franchise-changing. His shooting was one of the biggest reasons scouts became interested leading into the draft. At 6'9", the idea of a long wing who could defend multiple positions and consistently space the floor sounded extremely valuable in today's NBA. The problem is that while Risacher showed flashes as a shooter overseas, he never looked like the type of elite offensive player capable of carrying an NBA offense. He wasn't breaking down defenders off the dribble, creating difficult shots consistently, or dominating games through scoring. Most of his offense came within the flow of the system rather than from him taking control individually. That's where the concerns started growing louder once he entered the NBA. The higher the level became, the more his limitations started standing out. Risacher moves well for his size and has useful versatility, but he doesn't possess overwhelming explosiveness or advanced shot creation. Too often he blends into the flow of games instead of controlling them. And for a rotational wing or complementary starter, that's perfectly fine. Plenty of players build strong careers playing that role, but expectations completely change once you're the number 1 overall pick. Fair or unfair, fans expect top picks to eventually show signs of superstardom. They want moments that make them believe they're watching a future franchise player develop in real time. So far, Risacher still feels closer to the same prospect people debated before the draft. A solid modern wing with intriguing tools, but not somebody who consistently looks like the best player on the floor. That's why comparisons to players like Dante Exum continue to follow him. Not because their games are identical, but because both players were drafted heavily off projection and upside instead of proven dominance. And once people stop believing that superstar leap is eventually coming, the pressure attached to being selected number 1 overall becomes impossible to avoid. Stunt number 3, Atlanta might already be moving on. What makes Zaccharie Risacher's situation even more concerning is the fact that Atlanta's timeline may not realistically match the amount of patience he needs to fully develop. Normally, when a team drafts a player number 1 overall, the organization commits itself completely to building around that player for years to come. They live with the mistakes, prioritize development, and slowly hand the keys over as the young prospect grows into a franchise centerpiece. But Atlanta already feels like a franchise moving in a different direction faster than expected. After moving on from Trae Young, the Hawks entered a strange transitional phase where the roster suddenly became younger and far more unpredictable. In theory, that should have opened the door for Risacher to naturally grow into a bigger role. Instead, the opposite almost happened. Even with more opportunity available, he still hasn't looked like the clear face of the franchise. Jalen Johnson's rise has continued grabbing attention, and now with another lottery pick entering the organization, Atlanta suddenly has multiple young players competing for long-term importance within the rebuild. That's where the pressure starts becoming dangerous for Risacher. Every new prospect Atlanta brings in immediately becomes another comparison point. Fans naturally begin asking who looks more explosive, who plays with more confidence, and who feels more capable of eventually becoming a true star. And when you're the number 1 overall pick, those comparisons hit harder because expectations were supposed to separate you from everybody else in the first place. What also hurts Risacher is that his game still feels more complimentary than commanding. There are flashes of useful two-way ability, solid shooting potential and defensive versatility. With Risacher, the development still feels quieter and more subtle. You can see the outline of a good NBA player, but not necessarily the kind of player teams usually draft first overall to build an entire future around. And that's why the pressure surrounding him already feels unusually high heading into his third season. Fair or unfair, fans expect visible star progression from a number 1 pick fairly quickly. If Risacher continues looking the way he does while Atlanta keeps reshaping the roster around him, the conversation may slowly stop becoming about whether he was the right pick and start becoming about whether the Hawks already know the answer themselves. All in all, Zaccharie Risacher's career is still young enough to where everything being said right now could eventually age badly. Plenty of players develop slower than expected, especially international wings entering the NBA at a young age. So this isn't me saying his story is completely finished already. But at the same time, being the number 1 overall pick comes with a completely different level of pressure and evaluation. Fair or unfair, players drafted that high are unable to run from the expectations, and through 2 seasons, Risacher still feels more like a player teams win with rather than a player teams build around. That's ultimately why the criticism around him keeps growing louder. It's not that he looks like a terrible NBA player, it's that people still struggle to see what made him worthy of being selected first overall in the first place. Atlanta gambled on projection, upside, and fit during one of the weakest draft classes in years. Now, heading into year 3, the Hawks are still searching for signs that gamble was worth it. Maybe Risacher eventually proves everybody wrong, but as of today, the concerns around him feel a lot more real than the superstar potential that once got him drafted first overall. Salute, much respect, but for these reasons, his growth is being stunted. It's your boy JC Stunted Growth, and I'm out.